Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Cardinal Check In. We are experiencing some unprecedented and often confusing times these days, so we wanted to take an opportunity to allow you to hear directly from our leadership team about updates and schedules and other decisions surrounding William Jewell Athletics. This is a series we started for us this fall, and one will continue just as long as we need. With that being said, I'm pleased to be joined today by Director of Athletics Tom Eisenhauer. Tom, thanks for taking just a little bit of time out of your very busy schedule.
Yeah, Jalen, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So a lot of big decisions have been made over the last 6 months, many of them very, very difficult decisions. At Jewell, we were one of the first teams in our league to suspend sports in the spring. The GLVC as a whole followed very quickly, and then again followed very quickly by the NCAA National Office canceling spring championships. Sometimes there's some confusion around those decisions. It's not just you as the athletic director or our conference commissioner or even the NCAA president as the sole decision makers. Start us off today by telling us just a little bit about the process of those decisions. How are those decisions made at the institutional, conference, or even national level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important, and I'm glad we're talking about that today because, I do want to make sure there is transparency on how decisions are made and what we're doing. So starting with the national office, I think it's really important to understand that at the NCAA, it's an association of member institutions. And so when you really think about it, it's presidents, chancellors, other chief executive officers from the member institutions from all three divisions that are ultimately the decision makers. Now, there's various committees, there's various boards, and there's a lot of levels of approval processes, things to go through. But where the NCAA has actual governance has to do with issues affecting championships or really of issues affecting the association as a whole, all three divisions. And so we saw that last spring when the winter championships were canceled and when the spring championships were canceled. Well, the NCAA at that point did not say that schools had to cancel regular season or conference competition. The autonomy of those decisions rests with the schools themselves and within the conference offices. And so as you mentioned, the GLVC as a league made that decision. But that decision wasn't made by the commissioner. That decision was made by the directors of athletics from each institution, by the president or chancellor from each institution, and certainly with input from sports medicine teams and other entities on campus. So those are really the big players. On our campus as a whole, we have a very collaborative approach to everything that we do. I work very closely with Dr. McLeod-Walls, and we meet frequently. And so when it comes down to matters of this magnitude in terms of canceling or adjusting seasons, we don't rush into the conversation. We don't rush into making any decisions. I mean, we take our time to really evaluate what the short-term and long-term impacts are to the institution as a whole and certainly to our student athletes. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity in what you're looking for.
Definitely. So we've got students back on campus. We're very excited about that. They're doing a tremendous job of following all the new protocols and guidelines, but there are a lot of them. The NCAA has a pretty lengthy document setting out the standards that institutions have to meet in order to have competition this fall. In your opinion, what are some of the bigger things that people need to know in terms of those guidelines and the things that are really helping to guide decisions regarding testing and masking and ultimately competition?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with recognizing that intercollegiate athletics is different than professional sports, and it's different than interscholastics or the high school sports, and certainly than your club level sports. And the key reason being is that colleges are residential institutions. So our students, and especially our campus, are primarily living here and learning on campus, right? Everything is happening here. So the way that they engage in athletics competition, practice participation, that has an effect on the greater community as a whole. When you're talking about high schools, you're talking about clubs, and I know there was a lot of club activity this summer, but for a lot of those instances, there were events on the weekend. You drive in, you do your event, you drive out, so you're not sharing rooms together. You're not going to the dining hall together. You're not sitting in a class together. And so, the risk increases on a college campus for the transmission of disease because of the proximity of living together and the frequency of those interactions, right? So you're seeing the same people over and over and over again. And then, you're living in a dorm, you're sharing bathrooms. And so then when you add that in addition to the athletics, the risk of spread of disease, and not just COVID-19. I mean, we look at this every year with the flu, right? You don't want a flu breakout to affect most of your campus. But so then as we look at that dynamic of that environment, we're really fortunate as an NCAA member institution that the Sports Science Institute does provide guidance and does provide direction. And I mean, these are tremendous resources we have to be able to help make decisions in terms of intercollegiate sport. And of course, that's in addition to the strategic partnerships we have with MRI Global, with Liberty Hospital, with the Clay County Public Health Center. So, for us, I feel really good about the decisions we're making because we have all these people who know so much about the transmission of disease and disaster relief that can help us through this. But what's really important to know is that how that affects the day-to-day practice is that universal masking and physical distancing has been shown to be effective at reducing the risk of the spread of disease. And so that is one of the key components of the Sports Science Institute guidelines, is that when possible, as much as possible, universal masking of all student athletes, of all coaches, of all support staff, and keeping the physical distancing. 6 feet, we've all heard that over and over, 6 feet, that's the magic number, right? So, but for a lot of our sports, maintaining 6 feet is really, really difficult, and you can't guarantee you can do it all the time. On a tennis court, it's really easy. On a golf course, it's really easy, even in a swimming pool. So the guidelines have ranked each sport or placed each sport into a risk category. And so our high-risk sports, which are the ones that we postponed until the spring, which are football, soccer, volleyball. Basketball is also in that category, not a fall sport, and I think we'll talk about that probably later. But, when you can't make – those are really difficult to play those games and not come in within that 6 feet bubble. So for when that can't happen, you implement these testing strategies. And so for us, what that looks like is surveillance testing our student athletes. That's about 25 to 50% of that population every 2 weeks. And so we are doing that. The most recent test that we had, and I'm happy to share, is we did about 70 tests and they all came back negative. So that shows me that, one, our coaches have done a tremendous job at instilling the importance of this, and that our student athletes, even more so, have embraced this and understand that their ability to do this is what doesn't guarantee, and helps give them a best chance at having their seasons, but also helps us maintain and preserve this on-campus, in-person learning environment.
Great. Thank you for that. So you kind of mentioned some of those partners. Here at Jewel, we have what we're calling the Operation Safe Campus, developed by our task force here on campus, of which you're a member, in partnership with several of those expert organizations like MRI Global, Liberty Hospital, some of those others. Additionally, we have an operational planning subcommittee in athletics that's kind of works specifically kind of for our facilities and our functions. They have set out a schedule and kind of guidelines for our athletes. Can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like? How did we get to the schedule and the protocols specifically for our campus?
Yeah, so, again, it all comes back to our ability to test, and, testing itself is a challenging thing because tests need to be preserved or a certain degree of tests need to be preserved for high-risk populations. So those that are actively being admitted to the hospital, people in nursing homes, the 18 to 24-year-old range seems to be a much lower risk population. Doesn't mean they're immune from it, doesn't mean that they're invincible, but statistically there's a lower risk of people in that age category of getting the disease. And so we have the ability to test, but we can get the tests we can get. And so there's limited supply, and there's also an expense to those tests. And we fully anticipate that when we do compete in the spring, that the level of testing we'll do has to completely increase. So again, it comes to getting us to the spring. So mapping out a schedule in which we're giving our student athletes an opportunity to practice in an authentic environment where it's as much like normal as possible. But when we do that, we've elevated the level of testing before they enter that period and then during that period, so that we know, we don't know, but we have a better sense of whether or not the disease is present on that team. but also being really mindful of not overlapping practices, minimizing shared spaces. Our students are going to come in contact with one another across campus, but as I mentioned before, they've done a great job at maintaining distancing and masking, and I really applaud them for that. But if we can do things to make sure we're mitigating it here on campus, and that's where having these defined periods of high risk activity where they don't have to be maintaining the masks and they don't have to maintain the physical distancing. We want them to be able to do that because we are preparing for the spring. We are preparing for our seasons, and we fully intend to be competitive and do what we can in the league. I mean, our athletes are ready to go. They're excited for this.
Yes, they are. So you mentioned it a little bit, something called high-risk activity. Obviously, we know the fall doesn't look the same, and we have some sports, like you said earlier, tennis and swimming, cross-country and golf, that will be competing relatively normal, and then we have a lot that are not. So we have a laid-out schedule. Everybody just completed their 2 weeks of what we call return to activity, and now we're moving into some staggered weeks of high-risk activity. That can sound scary. So can you explain to us what exactly is return to activity and what is included specifically in high risk activity period?
Yeah, so our return to activity period, that actually comes out of the NCAA guidelines for a resocialization period. So knowing that participation in athletics poses a higher risk of transmission of disease, the guidelines indicated that member institutions should have 2 weeks of this protocol before you get into your normal practices where you can just adjust to life on campus, and really for the school as a whole to make sure that we could handle students on campus doing the normal things that we do before we get into our full practices. So just concluded those went really well. But the other element of that is our teams haven't been in structured practices or certainly not any competition since March, and so we owe it to them to do some sort of a baseline assessment of their ability and their fitness level, right? We want to know that before we get into the conditioning and the training, that their bodies are prepared to handle the load that they're going to go under. Because what we don't want to do is, while we're trying to avoid the risk of disease, now we've increased the risk of injury because we didn't plan and we didn't go into it the right way. So it's really a long-term mindset of preparing for what's to come. And then the high-risk periods, again, that's when that masking and distancing is really difficult to maintain throughout the entire activity. So on our football team, our offensive and defensive linemen, if they start going head to head in the trenches, that's not 6 feet, right? And so, but you can't play the game of football unless you have those contacts and those collisions. And so we want to make sure that we provide a period for the student athletes to have that activity, for our coaches to be able to teach in that authentic environment, and again, ultimately prepare them for the season that will happen this spring.
Great. So you mentioned the spring seasons. Obviously, it's going to be different for a lot of our fall sports, as well as basketball is still kind of up in the air. So I'm sure that schedules are on a lot of people's minds. We know we haven't heard anything official from the GLVC, but can you provide any kind of updates on schedules or basketball, or when we might expect some of those decisions and announcements?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say very soon. So this week is the fall business meeting for the Great Lakes Valley Conference, and we'll be doing it through Zoom. Normally it's an in-person event, but obviously circumstances dictate us to do it this way. But that is the Board of Governors meets of the conference, and that's the athletic director, the senior women administrator, and the faculty athletic representative. And so those three individuals from each institution meet as a conference, and then they will vote on different items, but schedules are always one of the things that we look to approve. So we have draft schedules for each of those sports. Assuming they're approved by the Board of Governors, they'll then go on to be ratified by the President's Council, who meets a couple of weeks later. And so I would say by early October, I think is a realistic time frame to know what our spring schedules will look like. I'm hopeful we'll know more about basketball before then, since that playing season will begin soon.
Great. Well, appreciate your update. Thank you for taking some time just to provide some updates and some clarity on some things on where we are, how we got here, and where we're going with our student athletes and our coaches. We'll connect with you again in just a couple of weeks as we kind of move through this odd semester.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. Thanks, Jalen.
If you'd like any more information, you may visit jewel.edu/coronavirus for any specific information on the Operation Safe Campus.